The Confederate statues in Lexington, Kentucky are now in the process of being taken down. The John C. Breckinridge statue has already been removed, and the John Hunt Morgan statue is soon to follow. It is no secret that these types of Confederate monuments have caused a lot of issues over the past few months. After the Charlottesville, Virginia riot and the Durham, North Carolina riot, the mayor of Lexington, Jim Gray, decided, quote, "It is just not right for us to continue to honor these Confederate men who fought to preserve slavery on the same grounds that men, women, and even children were once sold into the life of slavery," Gray said. This is one of the many reasons the mayor, Jim Gray, started the process of removing these statues. These controversial statues have caused so much pain and suffering for so many families. Jim Gray wants to try and make sure that these statues here in Lexington do not cause any more violent protests and wants to eliminate the pain people feel by placing these statues in a more appropriate location. The city council has voted anonymously to move them, and they have asked Lexington Cemetery to take them. The cemetery had a private board meeting and announced that they would take the statues. In Charlottesville, Virginia, there was a huge riot over one of the Confederate statues of Robert E. Lee. Lee was one of the Confederate commanders. White nationalists found out that Charlottesville was voting to remove the statue and started protesting, ultimately causing them to be met by counter-protesters. The riot left 3 people dead and more than 34 people were injured. Throughout the riot, people were fighting, and a white nationalist man plowed his car into a crowd of people, leaving 1 person dead. The police were forced to intervene. The next day, the mayor of Charlottesville and the city council voted to cover the statues in black tarps until they could remove them. During the riot that broke out in Durham, North Carolina, a group of protesters gathered outside of the Durham courthouse, surrounding a statue that is called the Confederate Soldiers Monument. The protesters threw a yellow rope around the neck of the statue and pulled down the 20-foot statue. A video shows protesters cheering as it falls. They then kick and stomp the statue. More than 8 people were arrested and charged with destruction of government property. The city has yet to vote on removing any other statues. I bring up both of the riots that broke out in Charlottesville and Durham because they are the main reasons that Jim Gray proposed to relocate the statues that were in the city of Lexington. Over 23 cities across the United States have already removed Confederate statues, including Louisville, and another 19 cities have proposed to do the same as well. For so many people, these statues only represent hatred and racism, but for others, they only see the American history. We as a nation need to come up with a solution. The best way to make sure that people are not glorifying and honoring these Confederate statues is by putting all Confederate and Union statues into a museum so that people can learn about the history of these men and what role they played in American history, regardless of what perspective you have on the topic. The University of Louisville gives us a great example of why Confederate statues need to be put in museums and not just relocated. The statue was removed from Louisville's campus on November 15, 2016, and placed about 45 miles away in a small town called Brandenburg, Kentucky, in July of 2017. But this has not completely solved the issue. There has been protesters showing up in Brandenburg saying, quote, "We need to remember history, but remember all of history and what the Confederacy stood for, racial injustice," said protester Ray Strobel. But the mayor of Brandenburg, Ronnie Joyner, does not think this is true at all. Joyner says, "We all have our opinions about history, but I've never looked at this thing as representing slavery. You know, this is the Confederate Veterans Monument, and that's all," he says. It's all about the veterans. As you can see, there are 2 very different viewpoints of the Confederate statues. It is clear that moving these statues and monuments out of the middle of cities and relocating them does not fix the issues at hand. The only way to solve the Confederate statue issue is by moving all Confederate memorabilia into museums. That way we can teach the true meaning behind the statues and what role they played in American history.